years working in Australia in the context of water engineering, so designing like urban stormwater systems, and attempting to do you know, what is, I think, a very innovative sort of type of engineering, which is working with living systems. So we were designing like wetland systems and sort of living infrastructures that obviously work on sort of multiple levels in terms of bringing biodiversity and water quality treatment and, you know, temperature control and whatnot to the urban space. I sort of left engineering because I wanted to explore some of the questions around, you know, how we build the world, what we consider success or failure in systems, in a context where one could actually talk about technology as culture. I think I was really struggling in commercial engineering to find a space where that conversation could happen. You know, there's this very sort of foundational framing in a lot of that those are working in that field around engineering being this like problem solving practice, right, where there are these sort of normative assumptions around what the problem is and then how one addresses it, often through a sort of a technological or design lens. And so I just wanted to just quickly start with the very early work, because I think this sort of you know, she describes sort of my journey and a lot of the motivations behind my work. So, you know, I sort of stepped out of engineering and started to try to make more experimental or unresolved or, you know, systems that allowed me to ask some of these questions in the context of, you know, galleries and museums and in a more ambiguous artistic space, I guess. And so this early work, coin-operated wetland, is, you know, you can see me, the stormwater engineer, trying to sort of play with the technologies and the approaches I was using and I was working with in engineering. And what you're seeing here is a system set up in the gallery, and it's an attempt to partner a laundromat with a wetland. And if I could sort of produce a model for a system of water infrastructure based on mutualism. So of course, you know, the system doesn't comply with health guidelines. It is a sort of para-functional system, to borrow a word from Anthony Dunn, where, you know, it's sort of inefficiency. You can only do a couple of loads of wash a day. You know, I definitely wouldn't be drinking the water coming out of it, but, you know, it did produce white laundry, right? So it did what I set out to do, which is launder clothes, you know, and but, you know, it trades some efficiency. It doesn't export all the risk in the system to an external environment or to the other species involved, and rather it attempts to sort of balance risk more between the human and the wetland, and it sort of works at the speed and pace of the wetland itself, right? So I'm completely relying on, you know, the root systems of those plants to do all my water filtration, oxygenation, pull nutrients out, and so forth. So what do human systems look like when they are designed on with a more multi-species agenda, or based on a multi-species metric, where, you know, should the wetland die, the whole system fails, right? We need both, you know, human use and wetland health for this system to be successful, right? So really, I'm trying to use my practice to sort of create these sort of other models for how we might think about, or, you know, guiding principles for how we might design technologies. And this is, sorry, I can't figure out these slides. This is a sort of practice I'm calling eccentric engineering, right? Where systems might not appear to work initially. I definitely lost a lot of sleep with that wetland project because I was worried I was going to kill someone. You know, thinking that, you know, I had to comply with these sort of worst case scenario health guidelines in that context. But instead, you know, could we, systems that we would conventionally think of being inefficient, like how can we pay attention to their other affordances, how they might create a space for other multi-species worlds, for renewing or restoring, you know, interspecies relationality, they might work at a different pace, but like how can we sort of take some of those logics and multi-species protocols on and try to design with them. Okay, so just really quickly, since that time I've been doing work to explore questions around data-driven practices in AI. Obviously, artificial intelligence and these methods of making decisions with computers is sort of infiltrated so many aspects of our lives. And I started getting very interested in how AI would play out in the context of environmental management. And so some works that have sort of tugged at those questions. Deep Swamp is a project that was from 2018, and it examines the use of AI, optimization, and how these technologies might distribute agency in human environment relations. So it's a work that takes the form of a triptych of semi-inundated environments. You see some more wetlands. I'm obsessed with wetlands. But I've given over the management of each of these wetlands to, a really simple AI system. So it's just using very simple machine vision system to, each wetland takes photos of itself, and it assesses whether it thinks it has produced what it understands to be a wetland, right? So and based on that assessment, so that visual assessment, it's able to like modify the conditions in each garden. So change water levels, mist, light levels, water circulation, and then it iterates. So then it'll take a photo of itself again and see how it's performing. So it's also really exploring this, what happens when you start to use, computational systems, whether it be the smart city or the smart environment. You end up with this sort of optimization logic, where the job is never done, the iteration always keeps happening. But this is the operation, it is this optimization process. But of course, if we're going to optimize environments, the question becomes, what do we optimize them for? And so each one of these wetland systems is being optimized with a different goal, and that goal is coming from its training data. So the simple machine vision system I'm using is just TensorFlow, which is just like an off-the-shelf ML library, and it's been trained on ImageNet database, right? If you're not familiar with this, most computer vision systems use ImageNet. It's kind of like the default largest image data set, and it's images scraped off Flickr, categorized by folks on Mechanical Turk, and it's the base model in TensorFlow. So again, this question of like, and this has been well discussed, in the years since I made this work, around this presumed objectivity that comes with using massive data sets, right? There is this, we see this reiterated in the press still, right? This idea that more data, AI systems is going to give us a more sort of objective view on the world and therefore a basis to make better decisions. Of course, if we dig into this data set, and there has been really great work done on this, these questions of how these images are cataloged and categorized and tagged and who has done that work and the really problematic assumptions that exist within that data set, we could get into that as well. So, any art historian or critic of visual culture will tell you that Flickr doesn't give you an objective view of the world, right? And so why would we think that these images are going to do so, or these approaches? So one wetland has been trained on an image data set that is just photos of natural wetlands that come off Flickr. So its understanding of environment is just, sort of amateur photography of wetlands. The second one has only been trained with images that come from the history of Western art, so landscape painting. And that was a data set I scraped from places like Google's Art and Culture, the Met Museum, places like that. And the final environment understands environments as containing people, as containing crowds. So it's been trained on images of crowds. So it's trying to optimize for attention or for, the presence of gallery goers in the space. And so it's, it's working through this, this iterative process. Always iterative, never finished. The work's agency to make decisions becomes derived from how the patterns in pixel colors from its camera correlate to the patterns of pixels in the image data sets it has been trained on. It has no understanding of the internal process of each environment. So, I've shown this many times. Sometimes the environments thrive, sometimes they completely struggle. And yeah, so there is this really like outside view happening. This is the use of AI in environmental management is something we're seeing a ton of. I was really responding to programs like Microsoft's AI for Earth. AI for Earth puts Microsoft Cloud and AI into the hands of those who want to solve environmental challenges, right? So these are the narratives we're seeing. Again, we see a quote pulled out of the Science Times: machine learning is not biased by the human mind. So it comes back to this idea of like, can it provide us, can it save us from the politics of being human and from the, racist and colonial histories that we come out of? Obviously, a ton of excellent criticism has been done on these issues. But also, we're increasingly seeing AI used in the space of, species management through like smart fences, or you see here a sea star murdering robot deployed in the Great Barrier Reef. So what does it mean to like outsource environmental decision making to technologies through these means? Why is it such an evocative idea, right? That's, and I think we see some of the reasons here on the screen. I think I'm just going to skip over this one. Okay, so another piece that's kind of informed the work I'll get to in a second is a piece called Asunder. And this work takes a GAN system. So this is an AI system that, is able to generate imagery. And we trained it on Landsat 8 tiles with the idea of trying to generate, like fictional geoengineering scenarios using this mechanism. And so the landscapes you see on the screen here, none of them actually exist. Many of them probably look strangely familiar. This coastline, for example, these unmistakable islands. But you see that these juxtapositions with uncanny land masses or tracts of agriculture that could not exist at these latitudes. So there's the sort of impossible landscapes. And that is because these are generated by a generative adversarial network trained on, publicly available satellite imagery. And we're using a technique here called in-painting, so it sort of recombines images in interesting ways. And so these images are presented in this context. This is, as I mentioned, a piece. It's a collaboration with Julian Oliver and Banks Sojourn, and was commissioned for the Vienna Biennale. And it really presents a autonomous environmental manager, right? That's proposing these landscape edits. It's then simulating and modeling these edits in a traditional conventional climate model. So it's really responding to the interest in the application of AI and proposing this as sort of a literal proposition. And so, here are some like sort of before and after tiles. Is that animating? Yeah. So we also, the piece also shows you the sort of history of each location that we chose for sort of specific regions. I think the other thing this work is exploring is what it means to try to understand, or how computation is producing certain ideas of what the planet is, what the environment is. So we're also sort of putting alongside each other, these statistical methods, right, that I've described with, a conventional climate modeling method. So we're actually using a sort of open source climate model that couples like a sea and land, a whole lot of different models. And we're trying to use that model to simulate what the results of these fictional edits would be. So, planetary computation is something that, has been happening in the climate model space, obviously, for a long time. And so these models are, very different to the machine learning models. We can kind of look at every variable in them and track it back to scientific work. These are models built from theory, right? Built from scientific work, and have, produced our sort of understanding of the planet and of the, climate issues that we're facing. And so I think another question here is like this exploration of what would it mean to actually outsource environmental decision making to, an artificial intelligence, for example. And so, I'm going to steal a question that's posed by theorist Ben Bratton, who, asks whether AI offers us a sort of potential Copernican turn. Does it offer us a way to sort of recognize other intelligences or decenter our sort of celebration or focus on human versions of intelligence, right? And I know I'm over time, but I just quickly want to speed through this last piece, which sort of attempts to do this. So I'll just take a few more minutes if that's okay with y'all. Great. So just the last project that I want to share is sort of attempting to do this. So sort of trying to understand like what other, like how else might we recognize the intelligences we live with, right? And we live with many of them. They're just often not described in that sort of language. And this piece is also really inspired by the project you see on the screen, which was a project published a few years back. You've probably all seen it, brilliant work by Low Tech magazine. And they published this work, which was a solar powered website, right? So the website, if you visit it, is running off a solar server. This is like a small computer connected to a solar panel. And, thus their website is intermittent. Sometimes it goes down if they don't have a lot of sun, if they get a lot of web traffic. And this work was so striking to me for its, the way it was conveying the situatedness of, the online experience, which is usually so placeless. And so we were really inspired by this work and have been working on this project for probably about a year with collaborators Alex Nathanson and Benedetta Piantella. And this takes the solar server, and we actually built out a sort of planetary network of them. So we've connected up a number of solar servers into a network that spans different time zones around the world. And so this project really, asks, what if digital networks operated according to their environmental conditions? What if they were really in dialogue with their environmental context? How would our relationship change with the intermittency that comes with using renewables? Like, what are these like qualities of renewables that might be, frankly, as I look at my 10th hour on Zoom, a huge relief, right? Like if we didn't have this sort of ongoing, seamless, continuous connection. And I guess the underlying question that we're exploring here is, how do energy regimes or how does energy production shape culture? What is that kind of relationship there? So, our shared environment, whether we recognize it or not, is, full of other logics and other intelligences. In this case, earthly dynamics like day length, season, weather, all, shape the operation of our system. And we try to understand them as this type of logic or natural intelligence. So, one definition of intelligence might be the capacity to synthesize knowledge as logic and then use that logic to make decisions. And we are in this moment, as you've seen my previous work, of trying to outsource this decision making to technological systems. But my question then is like, so what logics are we using? Like, what logics are we choosing to use in this automation process? And could these logics be like logics that are from the dynamics in our shared environment? And so we do this, we have a number of servers around the world. And basically when you visit the Solar Protocol website, you're sent to the server that is in the most sunshine at that moment. So the actual routing of the website is dependent on the distribution of sunshine across the network, of solar energy across the network. So we're using this as a type of logic. These are what the solar servers look like. They're very simple, you know, small solar panel, Raspberry Pi. And we're in the process of setting these up. So we have too many in the Americas, because obviously that is our time zone. We have one in Australia, we have a couple more coming online, and we're talking to new stewards in Europe, Africa and Asia at the moment. The website looks something like this. And so you can see this server panel on the left here, right, where you see server battery, the sites in high-res mode, which I'll talk about in a second. And that server panel has a lot of information about the weather and the energy status of the server. So we're very much responding to also ideas that have come from folks who are looking at sort of feminist theory and internet technologies. So a feminist server manifesto, I think, captures a lot of our sort of goals for the project, where it's about situatedness, it doesn't strive for seamlessness, it's about kind of revealing the processes that are behind these technologies. So, you know, I encourage you to take a look at that. It came out of a whole lot of conferences that these folks were doing workshops at. And the website also, you know, it will display in a number of modes, right? So it has a high-res mode, which depends on the amount of power in the battery, and then it also has a low-res mode. So if the batteries fall below a certain threshold, the website shows up without images and in a sort of more like smaller data, smaller size media. So also this idea of UX being like energy responsive, right? UX tends to be optimized for user experience, right? And obviously we could talk about the drive to increase the resolution of media. What if, you know, the goal here was a sort of more environmentally centered or energy centered, you know, experience? What would that look like? So a couple of other things that we're just sort of thinking through at the moment. The system also is very inspired by this idea of the honourable harvest, which is a Indigenous protocols that Robin Wall-Kimmerer talks a lot about in her book Braiding Sweetgrass. And she is an Indigenous scholar, but also a plant biologist. And so she's always trying to navigate these sort of multiple ways of knowing environments. And she talks about the honourable harvest as describing practices and philosophies that guide the manner in which we take from the living world, protocols of asking permission, evaluating impact, taking only what you need, using appropriate technologies, demonstrating respect, you know, thinking about reciprocation. And so, again, you know, with this system, we're trying to think about like, what could media look like if it was sort of constrained by, you know, the energy that it has available to it. And so this visualization that you see on the site, you know, each ring is a server. And so the yellow shows you the sunlight pattern at that server, and the solid colored bar shows you when it has been the active server. And so this is like the past 72 hours. So each kind of like piece of pie is about 12 hours. And as you can see, we have 3 servers in the American time zone. We have 1 in Canada, and the Australian one is sort of, you know, the offset one there. So as we get more servers in different time zones, obviously the network will also become less intermittent and potentially more resilient as well. One other thing just I think that we thought a lot about is the site isn't running any JavaScript. We really tried to keep all the computational processes server-side, and being very mindful about doing that, because that meant that we knew that they were being powered by solar energy. This project by Joanna Moll, huge inspiration. She does a deep dive and looks at the exact quantity of data and the amount of computational work that is done when she goes onto Amazon's website and buys Jeff Bezos's book. And it's like eye-watering, right? It's a huge amount of computation. And so this is really the business model or the logic that, you know, capitalist systems encourage, right? Outsourcing, externalizing work, making the user's browser run that computational processes so that they can serve us ads or show us recommendations, or, you know, this, you bought this, you might like to buy that, whatever, you know. And so she really tries to quantify like what that footprint looks like and think about it as, you know, it's this logical extension of Amazon's business model, you know, as they also rely on food stamps and exploiting warehouse workers and so forth. I think the other thing about this project is I'm also thinking about, you know, what does computing need to look like as we try to navigate planetary boundaries? So how do we not think about this as limits, as negative things? How do we celebrate intermittency? How do we design with it? How do we move away from this historic idea of computing, which is the Turing machine, right, with that infinite tape, to understanding that computing lives in a finite world, right, with very clear planetary limitations. There is no such thing as that infinite tape, despite the fact that, you know, the internet is often also portrayed as limitless, as a space to be colonized and so forth. So, you know, how can we rethink the way that we're working and designing with these technologies, you know, as we face these like concurrent ecological crises that I think, you know, we urgently need to address as you know, at a level of culture as well. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Sorry for running over a little, but we can go to the Q&A and chat more.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was wonderful to hear you talk about your work. And we also, of course, have questions open. For anyone who'd like to ask a question, you can speak it out loud. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you, or you can put it in the chat, or also feel free to send a direct message to Richard or I. So I want to kick it off with the first question. I am really curious about how you think of the role of like community and education, or even activism within your practice. I mean, they definitely seem like large concerns of yours. And like, so to what degree are explicit educational goals something that you develop a project around?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think when one sort of works as an educator, you can't really help it. You know, I think these, you know, questions of sort of trying to provide different perspectives on technologies is something that, you know, I'm trying to do both in my teaching work and in my practice. I think, like, as many of you would acknowledge, you know, sometimes this, I guess more recently, this has been happening through like participatory methods, right? So like part of the Solar Protocol work is, you know, building relationships with our service stewards, you know, with folks around the world. And, you know, we've started with people that we know fairly well because, you know, we've been building the thing and we needed to be able to like prototype with them. But then our goals with it is also to, you know, work with community and participants who might not be so technically literate or have access to these sorts of technologies as well. So I think that's something that I'm exploring more recently. These sort of like, yeah, I guess directly participatory type methods. Yeah, I think, I don't know, I think that's probably my answer. I mean, I'm also like involved in like, you know, open source creative coding communities and so forth too. So a lot of the tools I'm using are tools that are coming out of those communities, and then, you know, it sort of cycles back and then you end up teaching with them and using them in the content more directly in, you know, education as well.
All right, I'm going to sneak another one in before anyone raises their hand. This is in relation to that, but like speaking of open source tools, like something that I'm really drawn to in your work is there's a very specific aesthetic that's very unfussy and has like kind of this element of like chaos drawn into it through the different systems that you're interacting with. So like, to what degree do you tweak the aesthetics, or like, does your specific aesthetic vision come into it in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'm always really like obsessed with is the function or the operation or the, thinking about like a more systems perspective on the work. I want it to like behave in a way that's surprising or unexpected. And so I guess for me, like that's the like thing I'm trying to focus on, and that's often where I'm trying to make the intervention, if you like. And so then for me, like the way that the system kind of unfolds around that is all around how you produce that, or how you try to show that. Because often the challenge for me is like, it's sometimes really hard to understand what's going on. Like, and so like how, so there's always this question of like, how much do you make a system perform, sort of artificially perform its operations versus leaving that kind of like more embedded. So I guess that's probably why, is because it's that systematic or functional, quality or characteristic in the work that I'm trying to like really play with. I mean, also just working with living things is always messy, you can't help but make a mess and flood the gallery, and like things die and you have to go like, I feel like if you're collaborating with other species and trying to, and, frankly, like computing sometimes as well, you kind of, it's always, a negotiation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to call on Io.
Hi, Io. Nice to see you.
Hey, Tega, great to see you.
We used to share a studio back in the
day. I know. Yeah, so Tega, I had another question, but I'm going to leave that question for this question. You talked about aesthetics, right? You talked about the technical stuff. You've talked about the collaboration with other species. I want to know from you, and I've gotten a little taste of this, but I want to know from you, and this I think would be helpful for students. Can you speak a little bit about organization, management, and finance? How do you go about getting all of this done, right? So that's more so, like we have the creative side, but there's also the organizational and management. And I think that that's really important for folks to hear about.
Such a great question, because it's, it's the drama of being an artist, is how you get stuff done. So I guess the reason, I've set up my life so that I teach and I'm in academia because my work is recognized as my research, right? And it also is in dialogue with my teaching. So I've chosen this sort of relationship between like my job and my research for these reasons, because I think there's a lot of overlap, and obviously it's very, very, very hard to be an artist in the US without some sort of institutional support, right? Unfortunately, that is the situation we're in. So particularly when you're doing like work like this, which, I'm not selling lots of paintings to anyone, unfortunately, so this is like, these are often site-specific things, or they're like, I do a lot of practice, which is like digital and internet-based work. And so it's hard to like, sell that stuff. So I don't really have a practice where I'm able to rely on the sales of pieces to fund my work, but I have had some good luck and good fortune to, often I receive commissions. So the Solar Protocol thing was funded through an I-beam program. Some of this work was funded through the Australia Council for the Arts, because we have more kind of public funding for art in Australia than is available here, in that as an individual you can kind of approach get funding directly from the equivalent of the NEA, which again I know is not the case here. but yeah, increasingly a lot of the commissions I get are very small, honestly. And so then, you know, you're just sort of improvising, like maybe you're borrowing gear from people, or, you know, selling it after you finish using it, or being kind of flexible like that as well. What else can I say? How do I get it done? Typically I'm collaborating with people, and, you know, mostly I acknowledge that in the way that the, you know, work is credited. I rarely like do solo shows, and that's because I think, you know, when you're doing like experimentation with like technologies like I am, I mean, they're collaborations whether you put everyone's name on it or not, right? And you can look at artists' work and artists' exhibitions, and you see how people manage that sort of crediting. Mostly the key collaborators on the work, we just all put our names on it and do that. You know, and typically I'm working with people with different skill sets, right? So, you know, with Solar Protocol, you know, I did the front end, one of my collaborators did the back end, and one of my other collaborators did the hardware, right? So we're sort of all got different specialties. And I think working with this style of kind of installation work or systems work, you sort of need to do that, because you can't be an expert in all of those things and have it actually be well executed. So yeah, collaboration's super important to me. Yeah, and I guess you just work really hard. I mean, I could ask you the same question, Io. Yeah, I mean, it's a big time commitment, and it's the best and worst thing about this career, right? Is that there's always books to read, there's always work to see, there's always like fascinating, amazing practice going on that you don't have enough time to engage with. But then the blurriness between, yeah, like life and work is like super unclear. And yeah, you know, so I think, yeah, the balancing between how you make that work is just a challenge with the space in general. Does that answer your question? Did you want to be any more specific? No? Okay.
Well, thanks for that question, Io. That is always a question I want to ask people as well. Whit, please go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. So one question I had, sort of also kind of, I guess, I know that you have talked about building a relationship with these other species and like interspecies connection in your work. And I was kind of wondering, like, how do you see these like machine systems or algorithm systems also as like another either collaborator or another like piece of your work, and I guess how you see your relationship to these to the machines?
I mean, they're absolutely, I don't know if I'd call them collaborators, because, you know, they're still pretty like, they're just going to do what you tell them to do, right? Like, or they're not going to do anything at all, right? You know, I think they still don't have the agency that we you know, that we give them in kind of like cultural mythology around them, right? So I would say like they're definitely like things that you're negotiating with. And, you know, I think often I'm interested in sort of works that are almost like experiments, right? So the Deep Swamp project plays out differently every time I show it. And, you know, it's sort of much more a generative type of process where it's like you set up the conditions and then it kind of plays out. You know, and I think the Solar Protocol work has some of those qualities too, in that we sort of made this system, and now we're in the process of like building it out, and the way that the logic and the operation of it is also a little bit unknown. Like it does things all the time where you're like, what's happening there, right? yeah, I mean, so I guess I don't have a clear answer for you where I don't necessarily, I think like anthropomorphizing AI is like not cool, and it's sort of part of the problem that we have with it, in that like it's useful because it offers a very different way of processing the world to what a human can do, right? It can identify patterns in data sets and whatnot that is beyond human comprehension. Like we couldn't, like a human process couldn't do that. And so actually I don't think like it's valuable for it being alike us at all. Like it's about its difference, which is why it is interesting. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, to piggyback on that, I'm curious, like what, I don't know, I sense a kind of ambiguity in your work with AI of how you feel about how it's being used and what its potentials are. Like, do you have a sense of how you do wish our culture would engage with AI or continue to develop it? Not that you have to have all the answers, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think like any technology, it offers opportunities and, risks or pitfalls. I think if it's deployed with this kind of like totalizing promise of objectivity or all-seeing perspectives, deeply problematic, because what can give us that? That's a fantasy. That's like a modernist fantasy that but still like that, it carries that with it. So I think that's really dangerous. But like, what are some interesting use cases is like the way that it can manipulate our attention, right? So like our social media addictions show that, unfortunately. Like I don't think that's necessarily being positive for anyone, but like, I'm super interested in like apps like iNaturalist or like these kind of apps that are trying to use AI to help us pay attention to like the species we live with more, or like, assist us in identifying, what are those trees on your street? Like maybe it can't definitively give you the answer, but it can give you a hint. And then so on iNaturalist, then, then there's a human recognition as well. So then like a human will confirm the identification. But it is amazing that if you use that app a lot, all of a sudden you do start to see, the things the life forms that share your space. And like it gives you a literacy that you wouldn't otherwise have had. So I do think there is really interesting like applications and potentials for it. But I think, you have to have kind of a tepid, like, I think you need to be suspicious of it and skeptical always. Yeah, and like this Merlin bird ID stuff, yeah, like, I mean, that stuff is so like beautiful, delightful, and I think it can really cultivate a new literacy. But I think, the other thing that, and this is where we were trying to go with the Solar Protocol stuff too, is, how do we use our fascination that's been developed with this sort of idea of an artificial or non-human intelligence, and then recognize that those things are all around us, right? We live with lots of intelligences. There is automated decision-making in our environment, like on the day-to-day, and yet that language isn't ever used to sort of living differently with with the environmental dynamics in our spaces, in our lives. So I guess, that project's trying to kind of leverage the hype to help us kind of view these other relationships and other ways we could potentially design technology. So like, I really am trying to design infrastructures that are in dialogue with their environments, you know, and us. And so then there's not this just kind of like idea of like 60s engineering of us just like changing the world and we just like continue business as usual. This, I think, is the big danger with the geoengineering stuff too, is that, oh, we're just going to like offset it or like do massive carbon drawdown, and then we can just like peace out and not profoundly change our culture, which is actually what we need to do.
I have a question from Loria that speaks to the differences between natural and human-made systems along those lines. So the question is, in deep swamp, the driving mechanisms are the small manageable systems of pumps and lights. So how do you see those very linear and predictable drivers of change in conversation with the real counterparts like the sun and tides? And given your background in environmental engineering, which systems feel more or less reliable to you?
Oh, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, the deep swamp is there, you know, they are. I mean, those environments are little artificial microcosms. There's nothing. Yeah, you know, they are about the construction of this kind of artificial space that then is. That then plays out based on, you know, the agency of the life forms and that of the machine, and there's sort of like this dialogue. I guess, you know, one of the I guess since doing that, you know, I'm with the, like, for example, with the solar protocol work, it's like kind of about leaving the gallery, right? It's about like being out in the world and trying to deal with those dynamics. Yeah, you know, in the world. You know, their reliability, I think, is an interesting question, right? And I have done some writing about this where, you know, what it, and many others have, like, what is at stake with climate change is their reliability. You know, we are in a springtime where you know, the cherry blossom in Japan have bloomed the earliest, I think, on record, or second earliest on record. You know, and this is the like longest written phenological record in existence, right? So we are undoing the reliability of a lot of these environmental dynamics that come from the interaction between, you know, warm days in spring and these life forms. So what is at stake is that relationality. You know, phenological mismatch where, you know, the pollinators come too late because the flowers, you know, flowered too early, breaks down that relationship, right? And that is how, you know, climate change is impacting all ecosystems, but not just ecosystems too, right? The infrastructures we build are also built on an assumption that a climate is in a certain pattern, is in a certain state, that rainfall happens, you know, with this kind of intensity in this sort of pattern, right? And, you know, increasingly we see these big infrastructure failures, such as that dam that failed in California a few years ago. Remember, they had to close off the overflow because of a pothole that it developed in, and it was filling, and then they had to clear this hill, and there was this whole drama, you know. And so that particular, they were really worried that the dam was going to fail, and they evacuated like hundreds of thousands of people downstream. And that was because, you know, the snow melt from the mountains in its catchment was much more intense than usual and happened much earlier. And so there was this complete change in hydrology in its catchment. And suddenly the assumptions we had made about like how high the dam wall needed to be and like what sort of likelihood of flooding was going to occur were mismatched to the climate we're now in, right? So we have built infrastructures that are synced to Holocene conditions that are gone. And so, you know, we are equally victim to like this phenological mismatch as much as, you know, pollinator flowering relationships as well. So I think, yeah, like when we talk about reliability, like that's really something that I'm really thinking about too. I can see a question from Richard. You have a diverse body of work in your practice, and from the ecology work to data systems infrastructure, is there a point of view that ties it all together? And what advice would you have to students who are developing a diverse body of work? Yeah, I mean, it all makes perfect sense to me. I think as a student, you have to, I mean, this is I feel like commonly given advice. I think you have to make work, right? And some of that work is going to make sense and feel good, and some of it is going to be unfulfilling or you know, not answering questions or not responding to questions that you might have. But and as you go through that process, you start to, especially being encouraged to write about your practice. Like, I think that's something that in Australian education, you really have to, like, in my master's education, for example, you know, we had to write the thesis and like really write about like what are your artistic strategies and contextualize it in the field. So as painful as that is, like, I think you start to sort of develop a vocabulary of tactics and approaches. So, you know, for me, like this question of functioning and misfunctioning or malfunctioning or parafunctioning systems is really key there, right? And so, you know, not looking at inefficiencies as failures, but looking at them as like something else is going on. What is that? Why do they fall out of like what's considered ideal or successful? And so for me, that's very generative, right? Because you can kind of point that question at a lot of different, in a lot of different places. What else? Often, like, I didn't talk about this part of my practice, but I often, with my collaborator Sam Levine, work with amassing or presenting large data sets. So these works often take the form of online pieces, websites. Hi, Christiane Paul, who commissioned one of these works from us for the Whitney a couple of years ago. Was that a couple of years ago? I think so. And so the piece that Christiane commissioned is called New York Apartment, and it is a website where we scraped all of the data from apartment listings in New York City. So every apartment that was for sale on Trulia, which actually is the same company as Street Easy, but you know, they're all just skinned differently. And so we took all of that text, all of those images, all of the videos, like everything we could to form this kind of like massive real estate data set, and then presented it as this sort of one listing, this one kind of very insane listing. And so, you know, Sam and I have done a number of these projects, right, where we're thinking about data sets that are highly significant, you know, and this is a data set that, you know, one could train machine learning models on, one could make predictions about real estate values or insurance values or all sorts of things. This would be a very valuable very valuable data set, you know, and how can we sort of present it or open it up for a person to experience? And so similarly, we did that with the Enron data set and have done it a few times, right? So this question of like, how do you create an encounter with a data set that's not meant to be seen or isn't really legible to a human in its sort of operationalized sense, right? And so this is another strategy that, again, you know, I've sort of come back to a lot. And so I think my advice in that you have to sort of keep making work and paying attention to like what the actual tactic is, what move are you doing, because you start to then find this vocabulary. And for me, it's sort of the form then comes after, or the aesthetic sort of comes from that work. A long-winded answer, perhaps.
I also want to just lift up that Christiana has said that New York apartment launched last year, right in time for a pandemic lockdown. Very timely.
Yeah.
If you're okay to go just a minute over, I think I have a final question from Sheeple, who asks, I really enjoyed learning about your work with kids. Would love to hear your thoughts about teaching art and technology to kids in this world.
Great question. I think you're talking about the Bushwick Analytica project, which was a commission from New York Public Libraries. So they were wanting to commission projects about, data collection, surveillance, privacy, and present them in the context of those libraries. And so I did a series of workshops with middle schoolers on how they might develop and place their own targeted ads. So we talked a lot about data collection, and then they developed advertising campaigns of they developed messages that they wanted to send to particular groups of people. And then from that, we then used the Google ad platform to then target their advertising campaigns to particular groups. And honestly, I haven't actually done a lot of work beyond that project with kids, a little bit through SFPC, because SF School for Poetic Computation, who I've worked with a little, has done some high school programs as well. So I guess those are the sort of two contexts where I've done that. I actually find it's much harder than teaching college students, because I think kids just are much more honest, right? And when they're bored, they're done. And, you really have to do a lot more work to make the content engaging and clear and get everybody on board. But I think, it's very interesting to work with groups like that when we are dealing with technologies that have so much like hype and gravitas, right? Because putting like targeted ad campaigns in the hands of like 10-year-olds gives you a really different perspective on what the potential of these things might be, right? Yeah, we usually see them used in the hands of like, I don't know, every brand on the internet and the proponents and people who are building those systems. But such a narrow use too, right? So exactly, AI in the hands of kids. I mean, AI is the thing driving these technologies, but I had kids making campaigns that they were trying to target at their parents to get dogs, to get pets, or like folks who were trying to target rich people and give them messages about inequality. And so you start to see like what are the other potentials for how these technologies could be misused or used for different agendas. And then I think also, I think there's also just a literacy question there. So it was very interesting for me. I learned a lot from them, because I'm of this generation where we've gone from like kind of broadcast media to the current state of affairs where it's, personalized and targeted. And so just even trying to share like what, understand that shift from their perspective really taught me a lot, where they don't care about what the internet used to be like or like what media used to be like. To them, this is their version of the world. I guess it's kind of like that saying that technology is just what happens after you're born. Before that it's just mundane, like the world. Any other questions? I don't know if I answered your question, but
the why we should get a puppy was definitely my favorite one, really stuck with me. I'm convinced. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know this is coming up on hour 11 on Zoom for you. So yeah, we'll let you go and have a wonderful evening. And I also want to wrap up by thanking the organizing team, which is Richard Tay and Sven Travis, graphic design by Richard Tay and Kaylin Chung, our program coordinator, Sam Morrison, and support from the program from John Sharp and Melanie Crean. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.